Hey, it's Andrew with the Isle of Misfit books, where we discuss books that have struck me and stuck with me in my 25 years of working in rare books. Today I wanted to take a look at a couple of lesser works by a couple of major authors. Iain Banks' A Song of Stone from 1997, and the second by Dan Simmons, his first novel from 1986, Song of Kali. I picked these up on a recent visit to a used bookstore purely because, well, I recognized the authors. Both authors are favorites of mine, but I was not familiar with the titles, and the similarity of the Song of Kali and Song of Stone intrigued me. After reading them, it seemed like it would be a good comparison video to make. So let's get into it. Let's start with A Song of Stone by Iain Banks. Now, Iain Banks is probably more commonly known as Iain M. Banks, which is the name that he uses when he's writing his science fiction novels, which are his more popular. And those are the books that I've read. Player of Games, Consider Phlebas. But Iain Banks is the name that he reserves for novels that are not science fiction, are more literary. A Song of Stone kind of has a bit of a sci-fi vibe to it, or at least an apocalyptic, either near future or alternate history sort of vibe to it. British society is collapsing, presumably world society is collapsing, and the main character, Abel, and his lover, we'll leave it at that, Morgan, are leaving the castle that they've grown up in and have lived in. They're fleeing, basically, war, and it's not specified what that war is, but it's not an invasion. Basically, society has kind of fallen apart to the point where it seems that the military, people with any access to military equipment, largely the military, especially in a place like the UK where you're not surrounded, not everybody is armed to the teeth. This would be a very different novel in the United States. But basically, they are fleeing the castle, fleeing the area because bands of armed brigands, you could say, have moved into the area and are taking whatever they can. It's devolved, society has devolved to the point where it is a might makes right kind of world. So they're on their way leaving from the castle. So they don't get very far from leaving the castle before this paramilitary/military band stops them, searches them, and makes them go back. Because they know the land, and the military group led by the lieutenant wants their expertise with the area and wants to commandeer the castle and use it to secure their own position and make raids, presumably, on the surrounding area. It's like a pre-apocalypse, or the apocalypse is happening, basically, in slow motion, as it most likely would, except in the case of a nuclear exchange or something like that. The novel itself then takes place in the castle with Abel and Morgan and the lieutenant and her men. It's a group of maybe 10 or 12. You get the sense that not all of them were trained as soldiers. Some of them are just men that seem to have glommed onto the group and maybe replaced other members as time has gone on. Some of them have military training, some seem not to have, some are older, some are very young. The main characters are Abel, Morgan, and the lieutenant. The castle then becomes the microcosm for society, and it has very heavy allegorical overtones. Abel and Morgan are sort of the aristocratic upper crust. They've inherited the castle, and their family has lived there for generations. And within the castle are all of these cultural remnants from their family's illustrious past. You've got the library, you've got paintings, you've got trunks full of old clothing. They're the upper crust, and then you have the servants, who most of them decided to stay at the castle, so they are still there when everybody returns to the castle. You've got the serving class, and then you've got this military class coming in sort of in the middle, and then refugees from the surrounding countryside who are camping in the grounds outside the castle walls. The castle is a great symbol or allegorical stand-in for society. The castle is inherently a defensive structure. You build it to protect what you have. You build it to conserve. You build it to as a defensive bulwark. Abel is an older man, maybe 40, 50. It's a first-person narrator. He's the narrator, so you get a lot of his perspective on things, and he's very nostalgic, very wistful, always kind of looking back into the way things were because that was when things were good for him. But as the narrator, he is not sparing of himself or of the events that are happening. And they just progressively get worse and worse, as you might imagine in this sort of situation. Banks is excellent at just really staying relentlessly focused on the action at hand. You get very involved in Abel's character, even though he is a despicable, narcissistic, aristocrat, born to privilege. But you still really come to identify with him and his plight, which is an amazing feat, I think, on Banks's part and a testament to the genius of this novel. It's brutal. I mean, there are some very violent scenes. There's some sexual violence as well. It's a tough read, but very worth it and very thought-provoking. I recommend it very, very highly. Thought that this was a fantastic novel. Let's move on to Dan Simmons' first novel from 1985. I may have misspoke at the beginning and said 86, but it's 1985. Simmons' first novel, Song of Kali. And this is a horror novel. It is marketed as such. Think you know true fear? You don't. Think you've read the most chilling book? Not even close. So that definitely hooked me in. I'm not a huge horror fan, but The Terror is one of my favorite novels of all time, not just of horror novels, but of novels, period. The setup is a little convoluted. It is a first-person narrative told by I think a 30-year-old, roughly 30-year-old poet / journalist, Robert, who has been sent by a major magazine to get the story on an Indian poet presumed dead, although they never found his body, but presumed dead for some 5-10 years, who seems to have resurfaced, and there are at least people claiming to have new manuscripts that he has written. So Robert has been sent or commissioned to go get the story on these new manuscripts that have surfaced. And these new manuscripts, even though they're presumably by this poet, seem very different. They seem darker, they seem straighter. Now, Robert decides to take his wife, who is Indian, and they take their newborn infant. So Robert and his young family are going to go to Calcutta to try to get the story on this poet. Calcutta, in Simmons's imagining, and clearly he's done a lot of research on this and a lot of research on Kali and sort of the religion, the way that Kali fits into the Hindu religion. Calcutta is vividly imagined. It is a labyrinth from which there is little escape. The heat is oppressive. The foreignness of it, the claustrophobic sense of just all of these people surrounding him, and the poverty as well, is really oppressive and really well done. Simmons really gets you into Robert's head very well, and he tracks down somebody who claims to have a connection to this poet, and the centerpiece of Song of Kali is a long story told to Robert by this person who claims a connection with the poet. And the story is horrific and gruesome, and basically, again, with some spoilers, the poet did die, but was brought back through a ritual to basically become a zombie poet spokesperson for the goddess Kali, the goddess of destruction, and is sort of broadcasting. Kali is using this poet to kind of broadcast pro-Kali propaganda, darkness, and almost a death cult kind of propaganda through the world, through this zombie poet. And we ultimately meet the zombie poet. He has deliquesced, that's a word that Simmons really likes, starting to liquefy, deteriorating. Robert does meet with the poet in a horrific encounter. To my mind, the more interesting aspect of this novel is Simmons's own ambivalence about the nature of writing, the project of writing. You've got the narrator, Robert, who wants to be a serious writer, who is a poet, but understands that it's very hard to make a living doing that. And then the poet that he's meeting with, this zombie poet, who is now popular because he's marketing this schlock, you could say, this horror, this sort of pro-Kali propaganda, these dark images, this horror out to the world. And that is sort of maybe what Simmons feels he is obligated to do in order to sell a book, in order to be a professional writer. Typically, as a writer you reach a broader audience, right, is to write genre works, which is what Simmons has specialized in. But there's this ambivalence about it in having his narrator be a serious writer, you know, a poet, a long-form journalist, going to interview this zombie writer who is writing horror. Basically, I think it is an interesting way for Simmons to kind of grapple with this idea of, I want to be a serious writer on one hand, a serious writer on one hand, and yet I feel compelled to broadcast the dark propaganda of Kali and bring horror into the world. And there's some of this ambivalence in some other Simmons novels as well, particularly Summer of Night, which I am planning on doing another video about. I will have a link to that at the end of this video. The book ends with a bit of a whimper, rather than coming to more of a cathartic conclusion or, you know, more of a satisfying end. Song of Kali came out in 1985, which is just 1 year after the second of the Indiana Jones movies, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. And I definitely remember going to see that. I was in the sweet spot age-wise. I think I was 13 or 14 at that time. And loved the movie, although I didn't like it as much as the first one. But if you recall, that also is centered around worship of the goddess Kali. That's the cult that is enslaving these children. Perhaps you'll recall that there was some controversy about that movie, about its treatment of children, about how it was kind of a dark movie, like maybe too dark for what Indiana Jones should have been, even though Indiana Jones is, you know, fighting Nazis and that sort of thing. But definitely like pretty dark. You had the priest reaching in and pulling out the beating heart, if you recall that iconic scene. And I don't remember if this was right around the time the movie came out or later. It must have been around the time it came out. But there was some speculation or some questioning in the media, I think, about, is this movie a little bit racist? Why is this horrible evil cult in India, and why are all of these Indian figures being portrayed as the bad guys? They're sort of being the Nazis in this particular Indiana Jones escapade, basically. Struck some as perhaps a little racist, and I have to say that's kind of my take on this too. It's like, as I'm reading this, it's a little queasy-making, sort of thinking, is this racist? Now, it's clearly very well researched. Simmons has done a lot of research, and I actually kind of admire Simmons for just going there and being willing to go there, being willing to risk that charge. But I do wonder, like, why is this evil coming out of Calcutta? Why is this evil coming from India specifically, and this, you know, worship for the goddess of Kali in particular? If you are a Simmons fan, I think, you know, you owe it to yourself, if you're a Simmons fan, if you're a horror fan, to read Song of Kali. I think it's quite good, but I don't think it is as good as Iain Banks's A Song of Stone. And again, it's comparing apples and oranges, different genres, different periods in these writers' lives, but both just great writers, favorites of mine, with impressive track records that, you know, span decades and tens of books. Both of them easily over 20 titles published, 20 novels published. I felt like these were both sort of lesser known works by these two great writers, and wanted to just have this comparison between the two. They're both pretty brutal songs, and I really liked both of them in that way. I would love to hear what you think about one or the other, if you have a preference, if you feel like even comparing them is a worthwhile exercise, and if you have any recommendations for further Iain Banks books, not Iain M. Banks, but Iain Banks books that you feel I would like based on liking A Song of Stone. I would love to hear about that in the comments. If you want to hear my take on another sort of pre-apocalyptic or apocalyptic slide kind of novel, I am discussing Ernst Junger's On the Marble Cliffs in another video, and I will have links to that coming up shortly. And if you want to hear my take on another Dan Simmons novel, which came out, I think, shortly after Song of Kali, Summer of Night, I have a video discussing that as well. So links to those should be coming up in the corners if they're not there already. Please leave a like, hit subscribe. I'll be putting more videos out very shortly. If you'd like to support the channel, I have links to purchase these books in the description box below. And I have links to my own books as well. I have a fantasy and an action adventure, and I am coming out with a couple of new books very shortly that I will have more news on very soon. So that's all I've got for today. Thanks for stopping by. I really appreciate your time, and I will see you in the next one.